Welcome to the module on Threat and Error Management. Threat and Error Management, referred to as TEM, has been likened to defensive driving for a motorist. Defensive driving is not the physical actions of driving the car, but rather the techniques to minimize the risks on the road. In aviation, TEM does not teach pilots how to technically fly the aircraft. It promotes proactive techniques for maximizing safety margins. In this lesson, we'll discuss the individual components and then review some practical applications of TEM. The principles of threat error management are to understand and assess the various risk levels presented by a threat, to gain insight on logical strategies to deal with these threats, and to reduce human error in daily operations. This diagram summarizes the application of these principles. On the left are the threat levels, and on the right are the TEM actions to deal with the threats. Low threat levels and responses are depicted at the bottom of the pyramid. The higher levels indicate increased threat levels with a corresponding increase in management tasks. The first step in the model is avoidance. It is a primary duty to avoid any condition or factor that could be a threat to safety. Regulations, company policy, holdover charts, and so on are designed to promote crew behavior that actively avoids threats. It should be recognized that threats will occur during everyday line operations. How the crew manages these threats determines whether they develop into an actual error. An error occurs when any crew action or inaction leads to an undesired outcome. Managed correctly, these errors can be controlled and safety margins preserved. Errors that are not adequately managed may result in an undesired aircraft state. An undesired aircraft state is an instance of the aircraft being in a hazardous or unwanted situation from which an incident may occur. Regardless of the cause, proper management of the situation is required to avoid an incident. If an undesired aircraft state is not addressed, it may result in harm to the passenger or crew and significant damage to the airplane. Although crew training and operating procedures can be applied to correct the situation, applying TEM principles before reaching this point would have averted the problem. Threats are defined as events or errors that occur outside the influence of the flight crew, increase the operational complexity of the flight, and require crew attention and management if safety margins are to be maintained. For example, inclement weather and an icy runway with poor braking action could be considered a threat to safety. Threats can be generally split into two categories: environmental and organizational. Environmental threats are events or conditions that have an observable effect on the flight but are outside the influence of the flight crew. Some environmental threats can be known, such as weather conditions, while others may be unexpected, such as an engine failure or a bird strike. Examples of environmental threats are weather threats, such as thunderstorms, turbulence, icing, wind shear, and crosswinds. ATC threats, such as traffic congestion, language difficulties, non-standard phraseology, and last-minute runway changes. Airport threats, such as contaminated or short runways, confusing airport signage, and complex surface navigation procedures. And terrain threats, such as mountains, slope of the surface surrounding the airport, or lack of lighting leading to a black hole. Organizational threats are factors residing within a system, organization, or individual that increase risk. These threats are not directly observable and may be the result of cumulative events, such as procedural errors. Examples of operational threats include operational pressures, such as delays, late arrivals, and equipment changes. Aircraft threats, such as MEL or CDL items. Cabin threats, such as flight attendant errors, cabin distractions, interruptions, and security. Maintenance threats, such as incorrectly installed or repaired components. loading errors, de-icing, and fueling errors caused by the ground or the ramp crews, and dispatch or paperwork issues caused by late paperwork or errors on the flight release. The philosophy for handling threats and errors can be summarized as follows: anticipation, recognition, recovery. A lack of adherence to these principles may result in the elevation of a threat to an error and a consequent undesirable aircraft state. Many of the best practices advocated by CRM can be used to mitigate the potential for a threat. For example, developing contingency management plans, such as proactively discussing strategies to deal with threats, monitoring and cross-checking, and adopting a philosophy for continual leadership, inquiry, and workload management. Some practical examples of these best practices are a thorough walk-around during pre-flight to uncover possible mechanical error, clarifying an altitude clearance to reduce the odds of an altitude deviation, briefing the cabin crew of the acceptable time and reasons for an interruption, thus reducing the likelihood of mistakes at critical times during the flight, or loading extra fuel when the destination airport's weather is close to weather minimums to allow extra time if a delay is encountered. Adhering to these practices provides the groundwork such that once a threat is recognized, the crew is well prepared to deal with it. Threat management provides the most proactive option to maintain margins of safety in flight operations. An unmanaged or mismanaged threat can lead to an error. An error is a crew action or inaction that leads to a deviation from expectations. Think of it this way. A threat is the result of a condition or situation that comes at the crew, while an error is a consequence of crew action and comes from the crew. These errors can be spontaneous, caused by a momentary slip or lapse in judgment, or they can be induced by a known threat. For example, an ATC interruption during taxi might cause the flight crew to miss the trim setting for takeoff. Or the errors may be more deliberate. The flight crew may disregard an SOP because they are in a hurry. For example, an unstable approach may be the result of the crew flying a fast approach in order to make up time. Errors can be divided into three types: aircraft handling, procedural, and communication. Aircraft handling errors occur when there is a deviation of the direction, speed, or configuration of the aircraft. Examples of this error include setting a wrong altitude, an incorrect power setting, or turning down an incorrect taxiway. A deviation from regulations, company policy, or the flight manual can be considered a procedural error. These errors could include items such as incorrect checklist responses, omitted callouts or briefing items, or an incorrect application of an MEL procedure. Communication errors occur when there are miscommunications between the pilots, or between the pilots and ATC, flight attendants, or ground personnel. Remember, the TEM mantra for handling threats and errors is anticipation, recognition, and recovery. The first line of defense in error management is anticipating what may happen, preparing and planning accordingly. SOP briefings, workload assignments, good communication, and discussions all contribute to effective error management. If an error occurs, it is essential that it is recognized as soon as possible and is dealt with in a safe and appropriate manner. Examples of measures that can be taken include the correct use of checklists, briefings, callouts, and SOPs. An undesirable aircraft state is a safety-compromising state that results from ineffective error management. It can be defined as a position, speed, altitude, or configuration as a result of flight crew error, actions, or inactions that clearly reduces safety margins. Simply put, the airplane is now in a position of danger. These undesired aircraft states can be separated into three categories: aircraft handling, ground navigation, and incorrect aircraft configuration. Deviations to the intended flight path, unnecessary thunderstorm penetrations, and unstable approaches are some examples of an undesirable state from aircraft handling. Undesirable states can occur when a ground navigation error leads to a runway or taxiway incursion. Incorrect aircraft configurations occur when the crew mistakenly sets a system in an unsafe configuration or mode. Examples of this would be a fuel imbalance, an incorrect automation mode, or an incorrect flight control configuration. An undesired aircraft state can be managed effectively. The flight crew can correct the situation, returning the aircraft to a safe state and continuing the flight. For example, a go-around can be executed during an unstable approach. ATC can be notified of a runway incursion, or the crew can follow procedures and checklists to correct an incorrect aircraft configuration. A mismanaged or unmanaged undesired aircraft state may lead to an incident or accident. Whether it's avoiding threats, managing errors, or recovering from an undesired aircraft state, there are many tools and techniques that can be used by the flight crew. Many of these tools are considered hard safeguards, meaning they are already in place in the system before flight crews report for duty. These safeguards are designed to prevent an error from occurring and to provide the crew with information on how to manage an undesired state. They include traffic collision avoidance systems, ground proximity warning systems, weather radar, standard operating procedure documentation, checklists, and training. Although hard safeguards are a significant TEM component, other countermeasures more directly related to human contributions are also important. These soft countermeasures include planning, execution, and review. Planning countermeasures are essential for the management of both anticipated and unexpected threats. They include effective pre-flight planning, effective crew briefings, and always having a contingency plan, or Plan B. Execution countermeasures can aid detecting errors and applying an appropriate response. These countermeasures include appropriate monitoring and cross-checking, workload management, and automation management. Finally, reviewing and modifying countermeasures is critical for managing the changing conditions of a flight. Existing plans can be reviewed and modified when necessary. Crew members should always ask questions and clarify any plan of action. Any crew member with critical information or solutions should assert themselves with appropriate persistence. As we have discussed, threat and error management stresses three basic concepts: anticipation, recognition, and recovery. Anticipation means accepting something is likely to go wrong, but recognizing that it's impossible to know when that will happen. With anticipation comes vigilance, and vigilance is the key to promptly recognizing when a threat or error has occurred. Once the error or undesired state is recognized, the problem can be managed with a recovery. In fact, recovery may be one of the most important steps in threat and error management. For example, a flight crew intercepts a false glide slope, causing them to descend early. The flight crew, anticipating a threat, notices this when they cross-check their altitude against the approach chart. Recognizing the situation, they promptly execute a go-around, rather than analyzing the cause. By continually applying TEM principles in day-to-day operations, the flight crew maintains a margin of safety by reducing the likelihood for safety-compromising situations. This concludes the module on threat and error management. Answer the following questions to assess your knowledge on the subject.
That is correct. That is incorrect. That is incorrect. That is incorrect. That is correct. That is correct. That is incorrect. That is incorrect.